Hi, this is Paul, and I have another new friend I met at ARC. This John Lundgren introduced me to Daniel Strange, and I started talking to him, and I was very excited because it isn't every day that I run into someone who is not doesn't just know the name Bavinck, but actually is fairly deep into the Bavinck family tree, and I learned a ton of stuff. And that's part of the fun of going to ARC. So, Dan, well, let's give us a little short bio, then we'll dive into your story, then we'll get into bobbing. That's what we'll do.
Yeah, great. Well, great to be with you. It's great to meet you at ARC. So as you can tell from my accent, I'm a Brit. Interesting, I suppose, the journey God's led me on in that my dad was from Guyana in South America. So Hindu kind of parents. And Guyana is a little country at the top of South America, the only English-speaking country, which was then British. So just before Guyana gained independence, my dad left and ended up in the UK. But he's from the Indo-Guyanese background. Guyana has Indian and West Indian um, ethnicities, so it would have been my great grandparents would have been Indian indentured workers brought up by the British.
Really?
Um,
When
so
would they have been brought?
probably late 19th century, probably.
Okay.
Um, so my dad left and then ended up in the UK. It's interesting. All of his 10 brothers and sisters have ended up in either Canada or New York, big Guyanese populations there. Anyway, married my mum. My dad was kind of culturally Hindu. My mum was Christian. Went to a high Anglican church, but nothing for the kids. So we ended up going to the Baptist church in a place called Southend, which is just about an hour southeast of London, and was converted through a kind of I don't know what the American equivalent is. It's like a uniformed organization called the Boys Brigade. It's a Christian foundation, but a bit like Scouts, I suppose, but
Yeah,
a
Boy
Christian.
Scouts used to be that, and then when Boy Scouts so Boy Scouts was kind of connected to the main line, and the more secular the main line got,
Yes.
then Royal
Yeah.
Rangers, my church at Calvinist Cadets. So I
Yeah,
tell
exactly.
people
So
I was
Boys Brigade was actually Scottish, founded by a guy called I think Alexander Smith, who it was great. I mean, it was very Christian. It was great. So I was converted, and then I
Well, let's
suppose
let's
because my
slow down a little bit because
yeah,
we're already doing the randos thing here.
for
So,
sure.
um, so your father has Hindu background, your mother Christian background. How did that
Yeah.
go?
Um, it was okay. I mean, I think my mum. I mean, it's interesting. My dad I'd say he was culturally Hindu, and it was only he was quite how do I put it? Well, here's the funny thing. This might give you an indication. My dad died about, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago, but he wasn't born with the surname Strange. He chose the name Strange when he came over to the UK, which was quite common for people to do. His name was Prashad, which is a very Indian kind of name.
Yeah.
We don't quite know why he chose it to Strange. Maybe, I mean, Doctor Strangelove, the Peter Sellers film, was quite popular at the time, but I don't know why that I wouldn't have been called Strangelove. Anyway, it is a bizarre thing. So yeah, I mean, this is especially Americans love it when I say I'm Doctor Strange because obviously that all kinds of Marvel.
So
And
so you mentioned your mother was high Anglican, but they took you to, did your parents
yeah,
go to this Baptist church or they
yeah,
just
no,
send you
no,
the
no,
kids?
no. I think they were just looking for something for the kids. And it's interesting since all the kids have grown up. My mum's now gone back to the high liturgical kind of Anglo-Catholic church, very involved. Um, but yeah, so the Boys Brigade, just a great Christian community, and I think probably I thought I was a Christian, and then I realised at one camping thing we did that I wasn't. And then it's interesting. My wife, who was she wasn't my wife then, she was going to be. We grew up together, and then she was converted, and then yeah, I think it was just the plausibility. I still remember kind of it was a conversion story in terms of the minister of the church we were at. Do you know the famous picture by Holman Hunt, The Light of the World? It's kind of a Holman Hunt's a kind of a 19th century, quite a kind of I don't know what you'd call it, not kitsch. No, you wouldn't call it kitsch. It's like sentimental. But there's a picture of Jesus in John 3 knocking at the door.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just remember, getting down on my knees in the minister's office, giving my life to Christ, got baptized. But I think because my dad's background, and my dad was quite reticent. He was always I didn't really want to talk about background and everything. But it's funny because we'd kind of in the UK, for example, in the 80s, on Saturday morning, there used to be these kind of terribly dubbed English serializations of the Bhagavad Gita. So we used to kind of watch that together. And my dad would like make curry. And so I was really interested in his background and the Hindu background. And I think I've probably always been quite an academic kind of person. So I said, okay, when I do my kind of A levels, which is kind of senior school, high school, I was going to go and study theology. That's what I wanted to do. So I got a place and I took a gap year. I did a year as a missionary volunteer in Italy with the Baptist Missionary Society. And then I went to study theology and religious studies at Bristol University. And I went there basically because of the guy who would become my PhD supervisor. Is a guy called Gavin da Costa, who probably is the world authority on the world authority on Catholic approaches to other religions. And I had a real baptism of fire. My theology and religious studies degree was incredibly liberal, and it was kind of it was known for, I suppose, stuff on sexuality, post-Holocaust, um, but and I knew that I was an evangelical then. I wouldn't have called myself reformed, but evangelical. And I think I probably made a lot of apologetic mistakes in that, I was quite mouthy and I wanted to talk about things in class and it was great because, some people who went to study theology sat at the back and weren't really bothered about the subject. I was sitting at the front every week. And you know what it's like in those situations. You have to do double the reading because there was no evangelical kind of, people weren't putting me in touch with evangelical stuff. It was all liberal stuff and in the Bib studies and theology. But I love theology and get this guy Gavin da Costa was a brilliant lecturer. So when I finished the undergraduate degree and did quite well, he said, "Well, would you be interested in doing a PhD?" And I'd kind of looked at maybe doing a PhD with Colin Gunton at King's College, but I stayed on to do a PhD with this guy Gavin in what was still a very liberal department. I always remember in when I first got to Bristol, the head of the department is I think she's still alive, a fearsome kind of pluralist German theologian called Ursula King. And I was like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and didn't know. I was so naive. And she said, "Oh, what have you been doing for your gap year?" And I said, "Oh, I've been a missionary in Italy telling people about Jesus." And she just looked at me and she said, "Missionaries, I didn't think they had any of those anymore. You won't be doing that in my department, will you?" But what was interesting there was, though, that over the years, it was quite a well-known department because of this lady Ursula King and Gavin. So we had some great, we had Ninian Smart, who's one of the godfathers of religious studies. He came and gave a lecture, and then I went to hear John Hick. John Hick's the guy who says all religions lead to God. I mean, he was in his like
Right.
mid 80s, but he came and preached a sermon. And again, that was an interesting interaction with him because he says he'd had a like an evangelical conversion, but then had kind of completely moved away. So I said to him, I after we went to this kind of it was quite an interfaith service. We had to go as undergraduates. He preached a sermon, and then afterwards I said, we've been reading some of your stuff. I see that you had an evangelical conversion. What do you think about evangelicals who stay evangelical? And maybe he was just like the way he put it. He said, "Well, he said I think they're retarded." I don't think he meant any kind. I think that was just like a quaint word for that. But so it was a real baptism of fire. But I stayed on to do a PhD, and my PhD was I was very interested then in Christianity, Christianity's relationship to other religions, and at that time, especially in the mid 90s, there were some evangelicals who were pushing the boat a little bit on what's the relationship between Christianity and other religions, especially this question of what happens to people who never hear the gospel. So I did my PhD looking at a guy called Clark Pinnock, who at that time was quite well known because he was the godfather of this movement called the Openness of God movement,
Yep.
which kind of, I suppose, radical Arminians don't like me saying this, radical Arminianism, but kind of denying God's omniscience and classical attributes. But he also at the time had started saying that people could be saved by Jesus without knowing about him. And I was just very interested in that. And Gavin, my supervisor, he didn't know much about evangelicals, but he was the world authority on Catholic views. So he said, "Oh, I'd love to do this with you." So I did my PhD on Clark Pinnock, got to meet Clark Pinnock, went over to McMaster Divinity School. And so my PhD was him. But it was also using him to look at a number of reformed doctrines around the doctrine of the unevangelized. Um, but yeah, so that was my kind of formal theological experience. And then I think by that time I stayed kind of Baptistic, but I think I definitely became kind of Calvinistic Reformed. And so even though I would never prescribe that theology degree that I did in the Lord's providence, I was then looking for a job after my PhD, like lots of people are. And it was probably a bit easier to get jobs than it is now. So I ended up working for the equivalent of InterVarsity in the UK, UCCF. And for 5 years, I just worked with theological students. So people who had like evangelicals who were working in who were studying in more secular environments. I just ministered to them for 5 years, going up and down the country. And at that time, there were some very strong departments that had good evangelical people in there in the Scottish University. I mean, that's all changed now. I mean, theology. What's happened is theology then merged into religious studies. Religious studies have merged into cultural studies, into humanities, and it's like there are still some strongholds, but divinity and theology as we know it is kind of not as it used to be. So I
Hmm.
did 5 years about that. And then there's a reformed kind of conservative evangelical seminary in the UK called Oak Hill College, which trains Anglicans and independents. And I'd got to know the principal a little bit there. And he phoned me up one day and said, I think a we need a role called public theology. I don't know what it is, but I think you should apply for it. And so I applied. So I was a lecturer in culture, religion, and public theology, which was doing theology of religions, but other stuff as well. And that's when I started to look at more not just at other religions, but on, I suppose, theological anthropology and how do we in the post-Christian West engage culture in general. And by that time, I'd started to read people like Leslie Newbigin and especially J.H. Bavinck, Herman Bavinck's nephew, through my other studies. And so yeah, so for 16 years I was a lecturer and then basic other, vice principal and then director for a while of this seminary in London. And then about 7 years ago, Acts 29, the church planting network, they came to us and to me and said, me and the person who was the principal, and said, we're thinking of doing an in context training. Would you be interested in partnering? I said I'd be interested. So I was given the task to see what we could develop, and that's become something called Crosslands, which I now work for. So I left Oak Hill in 2022. So Crosslands was kind of the progeny or the child of Oak Hill and Acts 29. So we had some of the academic rigor of a seminary, but the kind of missional theological depth and clarity, um, cultural engagement of Acts 29. And I mean, we're completely separate now. And so when I knew it was time to move on from Oak Hill, we we started to look for raise. It was the day before COVID, the day before the first lockdown. We started to try and raise some funds. And so, yeah, so 4 years later, I'm now the director of this thing called Crosslands Forum, which is a centre for cultural engagement and missional innovation, but part of this bigger thing called Crosslands, where I'm the academic director. So we have a seminary of about 150 students in context all over the UK and Europe. We do a lot of foundation courses for churches in various theological topics, trying to they're a bit like Lego blocks that churches can supplement their teaching. I'm a visiting professor at Southeastern Baptist Seminary because that's the seminary that accredits us. And I suppose, the other thing is that I'm a fellow of this thing called the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. Um, so yeah, so I've continued to kind of my academic writing. I've continued to write in the kind of theology of religions area, but two popular books have been how your average Western Christian can engage culture in general. So a book called Plugged In, and then this book called Making Faith Magnetic, which is really based upon the work of this guy J.H. Bavinck. So there you go. That's a potted history of development, really. There you go.
Wow, you move fast. That's good. Hmm. Where to begin? Well, first question, what's the status of Acts 29 in the UK? So I'm a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. Do you sort of know where that thing lies?
Yeah,
Christian
yeah,
Reformed
yeah,
Church
yeah,
in
yeah,
America?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So I went to Calvin College, Calvin Seminary. I'm a third generation CRC minister. My grandfather pastored churches in the Midwest and then in the East Coast, one in Canada. My father spent most of his career in a turning what had sort of been an outreach station, outreach chapel in CRC language into a three self church in Paterson, New Jersey, which is just outside New York City, kind of a grimy little old industrial town.
Huh.
I did 7 years of overseas. I was 7 years a missionary in the Dominican Republic, working with Haitians, and then went to Sacramento. This had been sort of one of these Christian Reformed racial reconciliation churches that popped up in the 60s and 70s, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and that way sort of similar to my father's church. But yeah, the neighborhood had changed, and then YouTube came along. I made a video about Jordan Peterson because his in 2017 because I saw him doing these biblical lectures, and I couldn't really get too many colleagues to engage with it because most of my colleagues are busy doing churches. And I had been quite involved in church planting before that here in Sacramento, and had been involved in denominational things in terms of church planting too. And then I started playing with YouTube with a guy in my church, the Freddie and Paul Show, the longest standing show on my channel, which nobody watches. But if you want to get a sense of my ministry, local ministry, you got to watch the Freddie and Paul Show. And then I made this video about Jordan Peterson, and I didn't understand much about YouTube. Peterson had about 300,000 subscribers at that point, and it was just at the right time, and the thing took off. I had people coming wanting to talk to me because I'd made that video and I started commenting on some of Peterson's biblical stuff. And then I just sort of did the work of a pastor with a lot of the people who came to me and
Fantastic.
eventually developed groups that I call estuary groups that are church adjacent, just open conversation groups that I encourage churches to have, both for people in the church to get to know people outside the church and people who are not Christians and maybe won't come to church anytime soon, but they're looking for a place just for open conversation about what's meaningful to them. So we have estuary groups, and then online have this. I don't really know what it is, but it's sometimes we call it the little corner of the internet, where it's a it's a network of channels or a flotilla of channels, and we do live streams and conversations, and we're just sort of addressing meaning crisis type things together. Um, uh, yeah, that'll give you
Wow.
just a little shorthand
Yeah, yeah.
into some of
Yeah.
this. So so I know Acts 29 a bit from, their US stuff. And of course,
Yeah.
from 20 I followed Tim Keller quite closely. I met him in 2006 and followed him pretty closely from 2006 to sort of 2012. Um, and so, because I was involved with church planting, a little familiar with Acts 29 network and some of those things. What's sort of the status of Acts 29 in Europe or the UK?
Yeah, I think I think it's interesting because I was involved with Acts 29 through Crosslands, but I've never been part of an Acts 29 church.
Oh, okay.
I think yeah, there's still a group of Acts 29 churches in the UK. Probably not as strong as they have been, but I mean my connections are more with Acts 29 Europe. So a guy who heads that up, Philip Moore in France, and I still chair something called the Arch, not Arc, Arch, which is the Acts 29 Research Collaboration Hub. And for like 3 years, I've led with Philip and another colleague who's no longer with us, gone to be with the Lord, but a colleague just trying to help the global Acts 29 family just have a missions. It's basically missions symposia. So we get speakers in 3 times a year that have all been recorded. We've had some great stuff on, all kinds of topics. So that's my kind of still my one connection with Acts 29. But I was always impressed. I mean, even everyone knows the history, and there have been a lot of ups and downs. But I still like the doctrinal clarity, the reformed doctrinal clarity, the cultural engagement, and the missional innovation. And I
Yeah.
think that DNA has. I was always very impressed by that. I think city to city is interesting
Yeah.
comparing because I do a day a week seconded from Crosslands. I work with something called the London Project, which is really city to city London. and uh, there's a different feel about City to City, which I think is interesting in that, people are kind of shaped in the image of the leaders, aren't they, really? And I think City to City has a much more does have much more of a Tim Keller vibe, probably a little bit looser, um, but doing similar work. So it's been interesting to be involved there. And again, I'm not involved with City to City apart from um, this London project, but where I do some theological leadership for them. But that's trying to help churches collaborate more together in London, and I've met some really great colleagues. Really, it can be very not yeah, it can be very tribal, and I think we're really trying hard to break down some of those, not just theological barriers, but sociological barriers between different that can be between different ethnic groups. London is an amazing place in terms of you know, evangelicalism probably stays at 0%, no more, no less. And one of the reasons is for immigration into London. So a lot of Christians move into London. London's probably a much more religious city than other cities in the UK. Um, Although interestingly, I was speaking last week in this city. I don't even this city called Bradford in Yorkshire,
Yeah.
which has 30% Islamic population. I mean, it's six probably across the UK is about 6%, so 30%. So you have these pockets where it's very uh,
It wasn't at
um,
Matt Barlow's church, was it?
no, don't
Don't know
remember that
Matt. Oh,
name.
he was a friend of mine. He worked in the same town in the Dominican Republic, and he
Oh
went
wow,
back and he got going with CAP in the
oh yeah,
UK.
yeah,
So was
yes,
their
well,
director for a
yeah,
long time, and
yeah.
a couple of years ago transitioned out to lead this church that he had been in.
Ah,
So
no,
it's
well, we drove past the Cap headquarters still in Bradford, but that was an amazing experience. But I think, yeah, London is a very kind of, as we know, very multicultural, multi-ethnic, and so it's been great doing that work and just, I suppose, being able to meet Christians who I wouldn't normally have met. So yeah, so still a little bit of involvement with Acts 29, a little bit of involvement with City City, but not much really.
okay. What's your sense of? Gosh, I know so little about this. What's your sense of sort of the temp? Well, let me back up a little bit. So when you're talking about Clark Pinnock,
Yeah,
a few months ago, I was thinking. So I've been okay. I made this video about Jordan Peterson. Fairly quickly became friends with Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke, who have both been, quite a bit
yeah,
on Jordan's channel. Both friends with him. And so the three of us then we've done some conferences together and we've sort of worked together, on a bunch of things. So all this meaning crisis stuff. So I've sort of had a front row seat of the sort of Peterson to Peugeot orthodoxy pipeline.
yeah,
Just yesterday, in fact, I had a really wonderful conversation with the an Orthodox priest in New York City. Fascinating talking to him. I
wow,
met him at the art conference,
yeah,
and so I started digging into the emergent movement and sort of the role that played in America because you had the seeker movement, which sort of was, late stage neo-evangelicalism, big box. I mean, still going in a lot of places in America, and I think some to some degree in the UK too. And then you had really a disenchantment, I think, with a lot of the instrumentality of that then gives birth to the emerging church movement, which sort of
yeah,
goes from, you know, kind of similar time to Keller. There's interesting. I look at the emergent church movement and I see that it really forked quickly. So you really have the young, restless, and reformed fork, and then you sort of had what become the mainline fork and the deconstruction fork. Nadia Boltz-Weber, Rachel Held Evans, and then a lot
yeah,
of people who just sort of deconstructed and went sort of mainline-ish. But you had the young, restless, and reformed, and of course, the young, restless, and reformed has plenty of its own fractures
yes,
too between it. Um, so that gets going. Of course, Acts 29 is a part of that young, restless, and reformed movement. And so now I think the sort of the trad cath orthobro movement in some ways continues on in that emergent trajectory. If the emergent movement is sort of the postmodern phase, Probably the trad cath orthobro phase is more, meta modern in terms of it's sort of a coming back to more traditional things. Where do you see where do you see sort of downstream from Keller and the Young Relsis and Reformed right now in the UK,
Yeah.
and to whatever degree you can see in other
Yeah.
places
Well,
of
I mean,
Europe?
yes. So, I mean, the UK, some of those there are some of that stuff comes across the Atlantic in very little pockets. But I mean, remember, in the UK, you're dealing with like 1.9 to 2% Bible believing Christians. So the some of the schisms and the splits that you see in the States, even across the little movements, you just don't see here because we're in a, it's a, you're, we're trying to, even though I think we are still very schismatic as evangelicals, I think some of that stuff we don't have the luxury we don't have the luxury of size or space to be able to kind of completely hive off and do something else because you're always going to be bumping into the same people. Whereas I get the impression that in the States you can move to the other side of the country and start again.
Yeah,
And in some
yeah.
ways that's something. I mean, that's something about the American spirit is that there is a second chance. You can do stuff again. It's part of your psyche. So I think there's a lot of
Mark
psych. There's
Driscoll can plant again. There's
Yeah,
he
yeah.
can keep
And
going.
whereas here, and if you think about, the Evangelical Alliance, which is kind of would be broad, is not just reform, would be broader, but would have a kind of standard evangelical evangelical statement of about 5,000 churches. Then the Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches, which I'm part of, that's about 500, that's about 500 churches, and we're talking very small numbers. So I'm always interested in, I mean, I know these discussions are going on.
Yeah,
They don't really make a massive difference. Um, I mean, having said that, I mean, we're having our version of discussions of the issue of, theological retrieval and what that means for things like the doctrine of concupiscence and all the stuff that is being discussed. I mean, it's interesting at the moment as we speak. There've been so many attempts to get a Gospel Coalition UK together, and it's never really happened, which is
hmm.
strange given that there's Gospel Coalitions all over the place.
Yeah.
But for some reason, it hasn't, and there is another attempt at the moment to try and get that done. So I think the UK is a very different place, and I think I'm doing a bit more traveling to the States at the moment, and I think my opening gambit is that I'm coming from the future because I do. Mike Graham, who's one of the authors of the Great Dechurching book with
Yeah.
Ryan Burge, he's one of the leaders at the Keller Center. So I think if those stats are true, then I do think there is a I don't know how you could deny that dechurching phenomena. And the Keller Center, really, the strap line is, open the front door of the church and close the back door. So stop people leaving, and we need
Yeah.
apologetics to do that, and open the front door. And I think, I mean, some of my friends, like I suppose, I don't know, friends in the know criticize me. It was a bit niche because I mean, I still remain very committed to Gospel Coalition, partly because it's interesting in the UK and especially in conservative evangelicalism. Tim's obviously an enormous impact, but even more so did Don Carson. I mean,
Hmm.
Don was a real Anglophile within the student ministry and student missions in the 90s, especially in early 2000s. You know, Don was the man. I mean, we all looked up to him. We all loved his teaching. And so when Don and Tim put Gospel Coalition together, there was a lot of love there. And I still see, I might be wrong. I still think that because Gospel Coalition seems to get it in the neck from the left and the right. It's interesting in the UK within generic evangelicalism, Gospel Coalition is seen as very on the right because of the complementarianism.
Right.
Whereas I know that, amongst certain groups within the right in the US,
Yeah.
I mean, it's seen as it went a long time ago. But I think there is not that there's a, I wouldn't struggle is not the right word, but I think what you've got is that people talk about this 1 to 5 spectrum where one, you've got the kind of John MacArthur kind of,
Right.
that kind of group.
Right.
5, you've got the more progressive kind of deconstructing.
Yeah.
And then Gospel Coalition was 2 to 4. So you had like, Kevin DeYoung on one side and Tim on the other side, whole
Yeah.
in creative tension.
Yeah.
Well, Tim's gone to be with the Lord. I think Kevin DeYoung seems still very friendly with TGC, but he's definitely doing his own thing.
Yeah.
So where TGC kind of fits together. But the other reason I've got a lot of love for TGC is that the journal Themelios that I used to be the managing editor of with Carl Truman in another lifetime in the UK. Gospel Coalition took it over, and I've been doing editorials for them for 7 years now. So I get to write whatever I want every edition, which is great. And I love Themelios. It's a journal for theologians and pastors. Um, so yeah, that's my view of that situation. I think is it a concern, especially with not just city to city, but those who have been influenced by Tim. My worry is that Tim Tim, by his own admission, he was a pastor. He was an apologist. He wasn't really interested in lifting up the bonnet and showing the workings in some ways. And so that means that I think a lot of groups who love Tim to contextualize Tim Keller, you need to understand he's reformed Presbyterian, and that in my view that didn't change. So what you can't do is a different group or confessional group can't come along and say, well, let's just skim off the top of Tim, because Tim's is so rich in Reformed theology. And what in part of my work is showing that J.H. Bavinck was very influential in the work of Ed Clowney and Harvey Conn.
Yep.
Ed Clowney and Harvey Conn were Tim's teachers.
Yep.
There's a
Yep.
direct line of descent in the Dutch Reform movement.
Yep.
Why I think Tim was kind of happy to not well, he wouldn't call himself a neo-Calvinist, but he was very happy to associate himself with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And
Quoted him
so,
all the time. He was very comfortable with, a lot of my teachers,
yeah,
Waltersdorf,
yeah,
Mao, these
exactly,
guys
yeah,
over at Calvin.
exactly. So I think now, and Tim was such a polymath and held everything together. I do, in terms of thought leadership of people who were influenced by Tim, and also realizing that I kind of, Tim had fingers in so many pies in different sociological groups of doing different things, TGC, writing, city to city, and I'm not sure how much they're all coordinated. So now it's kind of what happens to that thought leadership, and for me, it has to stay to the effectiveness is because it is great contextualized reform missiological teaching,
Yeah. Yeah.
and if you don't have those reform foundations, or the theories of contextualization influenced by people like J.H. Bavinck and Conn,
Yeah.
then I don't think it's going to be the same. And I think as a theologian, obviously, I want to kind of big that up. And so, sorry, in a long way to answer your question, sometimes in some of and it may just be that I'm just a kind of you know, pious fundamentalist theologian, but some of even the nomenclature, the language that's used in terms of church planting, there's a lot of buzzwords about all kinds of things, you know, and great, but where are the theological categories have to be in control. And I think this is one of my big missions is to try and make sure that missiology is completely theologically saturated and that theology has a missional edge. We know that even in very good seminaries, the theology department and the mission department are kind of completely compartmentalized.
Yeah.
And for the US, I think the challenge that you've got because of the de-churching that's going on, you're always going to have very strong pockets of Bible Belt, and you've got so much power, numbers, money, but you're going to end up with places that are completely gone. And how you're going to bridge the gap between the Bible Belt and everywhere else. So I think that missiological, even so, I teach two. Maybe I shouldn't say this. I teach two PhD seminar classes for Southeastern seminary. Great students. I had a group of four guys who are about to become pastors in North America, average evangelical pastors. That was a culture and context module. And then I did another PhD seminar on soteriology and world religions with a guy who's church planting to unreached people groups in Madagascar and a lady who's doing student ministry in Tajikistan. I taught basically the same thing for both groups. It's the same anthropology, it's the same models that you need. Now, of course, you need to contextualize, and they are very different contexts, but the theology behind how we engage, how we contextualize remains the same. And I think I'd love to see seminaries in the UK and the States really integrate in an interdisciplinary way, but still, for me, where social science isn't the governing rule, but theology's the governing rule. And I've been part of something called well, I co-founded something called the Southgate Fellowship, because where we used to meet in a London called place called London, with a guy Dave Garner, who's the vice president at Westminster, a few other reformed missiologists in Europe and the States, and we ended up writing about 5, 6 years ago this Southgate Statement on Mission, which was 99 affirmations and denials. It was much more than that because each affirmation has quite a few clauses. But we spent quite a long time on that statement, which you can still find on the website. It was published. Just where we think missiology should be, and I think there's been drift, especially on the move towards more social sciences. And I love social sciences, and I'd say to my very kind of conservative reform friends, they're not of the devil. Social sciences are so important. We need to do them well, but we need to do them theologically. Um, so that, yeah. So in answer to your question, I think that's where I see some of the lay of the land in the States, and it is an opportunity, I think, for conservative evangelicals or evangelicals in the US to look at the UK and say, well, this maybe is where we're heading, and what can we do? Well, one, what can we do about that? And two, how can we prepare ourselves
Yeah.
missiologically? I had a really, I might have told you this when we met at ARC, but I had a bizarre, I'd never been to Dallas before. I was in Dallas a few months ago. And for the first time ever, I was doing my material, which is all about how do we engage culture with people who are not unchurched and blah, 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 people on the fringes. And the people were lovely there, the people I spoke to, but I did think some of them are thinking, I don't think we really need this in Dallas. I think it's so Christian still.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
3 days later, I went to San Diego, different story.
Yep.
But in Dallas, and I think that kind of now and again, my interest there, and you might have some thoughts on this, is it seems to me church numbers and the Christian culture is very strong there. But what does that do for the de-churching numbers? Does that mean de-churching isn't happening in a place like Dallas, or is it, as somebody told me, or a few people told me, that so many Christians are moving to Texas and Dallas that there's just probably just a recycling of Christians. What do the de-churching stats do in a place that is still very, very has a Christian stronghold?
Yeah.
But then, of course, as I'm going round, I spoke for this great little Anglican, it's quite a big, well, for UK standards, this great Anglican church. And they were showing me, here's the church where a guy who owns half of Brazil, it's a prosperity church here. There's obviously First Dallas Baptist, which I'd never heard of, which has got a lot of notoriety in terms of its political affiliations. So it's just a kind of a smorgasbord of diversity, even Christian diversity, isn't it? Um, but yeah, that I found that discombobulating, that experience, because it was if I felt alienated in a Christian context because
Yeah.
I'm just not used to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well, let's maybe pivot,
oh yeah,
and a lot of, despite the fact that I've been doing this for 7 years, I don't do a lot of theology on my channel. I don't do a lot of direct theology. That's where I'm sort of different from a lot of Christian YouTube. Maybe before we get to JH, maybe you
yeah,
can sketch out a little bit the background of the neo-Calvinist movement, Kuyper, Bavinck, and then how that then trickles down to JH and how you got into this and why you found that
yeah,
gripping.
yeah. So I think I came. I mean, it's interesting. I call myself reformed. Obviously, some of my Presbyterian reformed friends think that because I'm a Baptist, I can never be reformed. So let's just pretend that I am, just for the sake of argument. Okay. So I think I definitely was committed to a kind of Calvinistic soteriology, and that was helpful for my thesis and the sovereignty of God in salvation and what that means, the usual stuff in terms of salvation. I think though that I've always been interested in um, life in general, difference, otherness, the arts, creativity, music. And so I was looking for something that was still reformed soteriologically, but that was willing to engage more with the world and a big picture of salvation. You know, yes, individual creation for redemption, consummation, but cosmic creation for redemption, consummation. What actually got me to J.H. Bavinck was providential, really, because in my first year at Bristol, so I'm giving all these reading lists on theology, and I can't, I've got nothing in common with anything I'm meant to be reading. So I go to Bristol Library, the academic library, and I say, look, there must be some evangelical. What I've got no point of contact, and I found a book by Leslie Newbigin, and then I was browsing the journals, and there was the Scottish Bulletin of Evangelical Theology had republished what was a chapter of this book called by J.H. Bavinck called The Church Between the Temple and Mosque. So it's chapter 7, I think it is. Then the new edition of that I've written a forward to, and I've been involved with it. But that chapter was called Human Religion in God's Eyes, and it was basically an exegesis of Romans 1. And it was the first time I thought, oh, I can finally yes, I can understand this. This is really helpful to me. Another book called Christianity and World Religions by a guy called Norman Anderson, who was an Islamic jurist, a Islamic lawyer in the UK, who'd written this book on other religions from an evangelical point of view. So I was kind of clinging on to those, and then Harold Netland, who's just retiring from Trinity this year, TEDS, he'd written his book Dissonant Voices. So I was starting to read this stuff, but the Bavinck stuff really struck with me. And then I started just reading a bit more kind of about Kuyper, recognized Herman Bavinck, um, and just they seem to be able to have that kind of Calvinist soteriology theology combined with an interest in the world, an interest in life, an interest in politics, an interest in everything, the Lordship of Christ under everything. And I think increasingly, then starting listening to Tim a bit more, starting to teach in public theology, where I realized that even in Reformed theology, there were these, there's this view called the two kingdoms view, and there's this view called transformationism, and what do I think about that, and all of those things, and just never thinking that I've always thought there's not it's not an either or when it comes to the cultural mandate or the Great Commission. We're to fill the earth and have dominion, and to do that, we need to make sure that people are converted. I've never seen those two things, but in conservative evangelicalism in the UK, and I presume in the States as well, it's just a kind of there's always the worry about the social gospel. There's always worried about a pietism, a fundamentalism, a retreatism, and it's just I've probably instinctively have, even though I've tried to work those things through myself. So I think that's why I've been attracted to neo Calvinism. I imagine some neo Calvinists would call me paleo Calvinist, and I'm still, for me, like fundamental, because I did my PhD on it. Heaven. I've done quite a lot of writing on hell. Heaven, hell, eternal destiny, salvation still remain very visceral, important topics to me. And I've had a little bit of like someone like Rich Mao, who I've got, I have a lot of time for, and I've read a lot of his stuff. I think we would probably differ a little bit in that he's probably a little bit more open to common grace in other religions and the Spirit's work. And he's just written a book, which I'm about to read and review, on the question of salvation as well. What does that? Is there
Hmm.
is there not an openness, but is there more of a surprise in terms of soteriological categories from a neo-Calvinist perspective? So I think I can see that neo-Calvinism theologically sometimes, from my point of view, can go a little bit left,
Yep.
but I maintain that I still found it a very helpful movement. It's interesting. I did for this neo-Calvinist handbook that's just been written by another Keller fellow of mine, Grace Atando, co-edited. I mean, I did the one on J.H. Bavinck, but I probably don't call myself a neo-Calvinist. Just, well, one, because I wouldn't be. I'm not Presbyterian in that way. And so I'm a bit weird. And this is the thing, you understand that, because of the eclectic nature, all of my Reformed theology was done not formally taught, but it's because I had to read up on it because I was trying to do this degree and not die at Worcester University, which means that I'm an eclectic, weird guy who's a Baptist with probably some post-millennial sympathies, a transformationist culturally, but still thinks evangelism is radical. So I don't fit some of the categories, but I think that's the kind of eclectic nature when you don't come from a particular tradition. And in some ways, I probably over the years have come, I wish I'd been brought up in a Presbyterian background, Westminster Confession. It's all laid out for you. But some of us in the UK, because it's been like you pick up what you can find. It's scraps to
Yeah.
try and put something together. And I think the Lord, I mean, the Lord uses that mightily because
Yeah.
sometimes people like that do ask questions that probably shouldn't be asked. It probably means that I've never found myself completely theologically at home anywhere, but that's fine. I mean, the Lord's put me here. But it means that when I'm doing stuff in the Southern Baptist Convention, like somewhere like Southeastern, like that is a completely different world to me. Even though theologically we're probably quite alike, I've got probably as many close friends at Westminster and RTS. So yeah, so it's a kind of a weird mix. So in answer to your question, that's my kind of dabbling in neo-Calvinism. It's a kind of a very sympathetic appreciation, even though I probably wouldn't call myself a neo-Calvinist, but a lot of my influences have been neo-Calvinistic. And then probably the other big influence, I mean, the other big influence on me has been Van Til. So when you, as you know, when you get into Reformed theology, there's all kinds of rabbit holes you can go down, and you can get niche and niche and niche, and and probably there was probably a day when I had a choice: do I go Van Til or do I go Doyeweerd, or do I go Volhoven, or all these different guys? And for me, I just always found Van Til really helpful.
Huh.
Again, it's probably easier because I'm Baptistic. People can think, well, how could you be into Van Til? So it's probably okay. But I've always found Van Til, and I love the systemic big picture of someone like Van Til.
Hmm.
Where so I know that he's probably the criticism is that this is idealist. It's too system driven. But I like method questions. I like systems questions. And yeah, you get down into the detail. But for me, I once wrote this up piece for Themelios called Meta Madness, because sometimes you can be stuck on theological method so much you don't actually do anything. You're just kind of, it's a bit like the golfing yips. You're just always on method, method, method. And I see that in myself. I want to get all the method right before I start doing it. And probably that's the tension that I felt in my career sometimes, is that I love those method questions because I think they're so important, which is probably why apologetically I love presuppositionalism, even though, sometimes they're presuppositionalists who've probably never spoken to a non-Christian for about 5 years. So it's kind of, you know what it's like. You know what it's
Yeah.
like, don't you? When you get the kind of the academic apologists like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so I think trying to bring Van Til to the masses has been another one of my interests. But
Hmm.
yeah, with the J.H. Bavinck stuff, it was that meeting in the library. And then I just started reading his stuff. And I've always found him, I didn't have that. I mean, maybe it's never too late, but I didn't speak Dutch. So I have relied on some of the English translations. It's been great getting to know people like James Eglinton and Gray because they're doing these translate. And there's more of J.H. Bavinck coming out when people don't mistake him for Herman. I
Yeah.
did a I did a podcast once where they invited me on thinking I was going to be talking about Herman Bavinck, and in the prayer as they were about to press record, we thank Dan who's going to come and talk about Herman Bavinck now. And I had to kind of say to them when it's not, it's his nephew. You've never heard of him. But I think JH is the man for the time, and he's my real kind of he's my real hero. I love the way he writes. I love him as a person. I love his ideas, and so if the Lord leads me to achieve nothing more than just repristinating his ideas, I'll be happy. Yeah,
Well, give me a little
yeah,
biography of J.H. Bobby, because again, in the Christian Reformed Church, my grandfather He's at Raybrook Retirement in Grand Rapids, Michigan. My grandmother is feverishly getting all of his books. So he's finally left with a tiny little bookshelf, and he's got Kuiper systematics and Bobbing systematics in Dutch. And so, in his later years, when he could barely remember what he had just read 30 minutes ago, he's still reading Kuiper and Bobbing in Dutch. I mean, in certain parts of the Christian Reformed
Yeah.
Church, these are we're not allowed to call them saints or to have icons of them, but these are the
Yes.
saints and the icons of
Yeah.
the tradition. But JH is by no means as well
Yeah.
known.
Yeah. So I'm going to get my, I won't, but I did this biographical piece for the handbook. I've forgotten all the different, I know his dates. What I don't know is all the different reformed denominations he was part of, all the initials, but you can
Yeah,
find
don't
those
worry
out.
about that.
So he's born in 1895, kind of, yeah, Christian background. Obviously, his uncle's Herman Bavinck, who's, very well known. Um, he goes, he did his, interesting. He's always someone who was interested in the emerging discipline of psychology and theology at the same time. So he does his PhD on this reformed mystic called von Suso, and looking at the kind of mystical tradition. And at one point he says, he his if he was to, the idolatry that he's always trying to stop him in himself is a kind of much more mystical kind of one monistic understanding of life. He gets called onto the mission field. He's in Indonesia in two stints. He ends up teaching in the theological department of Jakarta. Um, he had one little stint when he came back, and that's where he did this book that James Eglinton has just translated called Personality and Worldview, which is a brilliant book. It was to a group of technical students, technical kind of at a technical college. And he makes this great distinction, which I think we need to be using much more, between what he calls world vision and a worldview. He says what we think we say that people have got a worldview. Well, at the time, students are starting to think, look, we've got this idea of worldview, but I don't want to be confined by a worldview because I have my own personality. So the book is called Personality and Worldview. And Bavinck's saying what all people are born into is not necessarily a worldview, but a world vision. It's a bit like a compass to try and navigate your way on the ground level. What you need to do is you need to work towards a worldview, and they're not many because they're so capacious and thought through. It's more like a map than a compass. And I just think that's great because I think we use the term worldview a lot, and probably we do mean world vision because it's unreflected. Bavinck's thing is you need to consciously work towards a worldview, and then the Christian worldview is the worldview. So he writes this, and then he's back in Indonesia, and he's doing some quite interesting contextualization things. He's really into kind of indigenous expressions of theology, missiologically taking risks in terms of using indigenous rights and to kind of contextualize. He then comes back to Holland and ends up at the Free University, ends up a chair of missions there and also at Kampen. Um, I mean, I don't know all the details of this because I haven't obviously read all in the Dutch. There's quite a, well, not from his point of view, Klaas Schilder, who's the kind of the leading
Yep.
reformed light at that time. It seems as if he was quite suspicious of JH because he was quite risky. It's interesting, and this is amazing. Last year, 18 months ago, I was speaking at a church in Northern Ireland, and this little old lady who must have been in her late 80s, 90s came up and said, I can't believe you're talking about J.H. Bavinck. He came and preached at my church when I was little. And even then, she was saying he was quite a controversial figure.
Hmm.
Everything you learn about him was that he was the most gentle, humble, peacemaking, conciliatory person. He tries to step in when Skilder's kind of about to leave his denomination, start his own denomination. I think Bavinck was there in quite trying to keep things together, but that didn't happen. So Skilder's quite suspicious of him, and then he ends up, yeah, he finishes teaching. He writes I suppose his big kind of three works. I mean, he wrote a lot that's still to be translated. This book on religious consciousness, which is in the J.H. Bavinck Reader, is his main book on uh, exegeting Romans 1, Acts 17, and how that plays out, and this idea of the magnetic points that I think we'll probably come to shortly. Then he does a book called The Introduction to the Science of Missions, which then is translated by Ed Clowney and becomes the standard reforms missions textbook. And still, I think it's an absolute gem, brilliant book, dated, but you can contextualize for today. And then a posthumous work. He ended up, and this is the thing that I've been involved with. He did these lectures, which I think were in around 1960 at Union Seminary in New York, or the Federated Theological. Um, Mircea Eliade, who was one of the she he is one of the main in the history of the religious studies. He's one of the main figures.
Yeah.
Eliade, Romanian scholar.
Yeah.
He'd read Bavinck's Religious Consciousness, this little Dutch Reform guy, and invited Bavinck to come over and give these lectures.
Hmm.
And that was published posthumously as The Church Between the Temple and the Mosque, which has similar overlap with Religious Consciousness and Introduction to the Science of Missions. So those three works are kind of his big works. But he's theologically absolutely solid, but at the same time, he's really wanting to push the boat out in terms of engaging others, meeting people in love where they're at. Um, his big discipline that I'm trying to resurrect is this discipline called elenctics, which comes from 22 times in the New Testament. There's this word called elengo, which means to convict or unmask. And in reform seminaries in the late 19th century, and Kuyper had started it, there were departments of elenctics. So it's like missionary apologetics. And I still think this is where we need to be housing the study of other religions and apologetics in disciplines of elenctics. But in the introduction to the science of missions, Bavinck's got a whole section on elenctics, which I think is really important. So that's an overview. Very loved by his students, seemed a very gentle man. Went through a lot. Two of his sons, they were later released, but they were imprisoned during the Second World War by the Nazis. Um, Ends up dying in 19 June 19 well June the 23rd 1964, and it's interesting, I was born June the 23rd 1974, so 10 years before I was born. So yeah, that's an overview. um
Well, talk to me about the magnetic points. So
yes.
you've written a book now,
Yeah.
and why don't you talk to me about that?
Yeah. So first of all, Bavinck argues that every human being has what he calls a religious consciousness. And his exegesis of Romans 1, Acts 17, and other places. Um, and it's interesting because Bavinck, on the one hand, he's just the classic John Stott, isn't he? He's got the newspaper in one hand, the Bible in the other hand, trying to understand the culture around him and understand that biblically. And he says everyone has a religious consciousness, and that religious consciousness is the messy mixture of image bearers of God who both know God and don't know him at the same time, who are running to him as creatures and running away from him as sinners at the same time. So there's this dialectic, this paradox. So religious consciousness isn't there's a God-shaped hole and isn't that great? We need to fill it. It's this is what people do who have been made to worship God but suppress the truth and substitute it for other things. That is religious consciousness. And Bavinck says that that's indestructible. And this is the interest for me because Bavinck's writing in a very multi-religious context in Indonesia in the 1930s and 40s. But I think the theological anthropology is exactly the same for your average person where you are, Paul, or I am, or anywhere. And that's something to discuss. But I think there's a universal theological anthropology of religious consciousness. So there's a lot on that, and that gets into the analysis of idolatry. And he has one of his great illustrations is in Romans 1. It's really hard to understand what's going on about this suppression and substitution. And he says it's a bit like dreaming, and he has this really evocative illustration of someone who has a dream or a nightmare. That when you have a dream or a nightmare, you imagine something in reality in the day, and then in the nightmare, the idea is taken and kind of twisted and distorted and perverted and goes on a completely different trajectory. So I see a ticking clock in the daytime, and it becomes a monstrous regiment of soldiers in the nightmare. And Bavinck says that's what we do with general revelation. We take something in reality and we twist it to become that kind of, well, what Calvin says is the factory of idols. But the root is always a suppressed truth. There's always base, there's always truth in it, but it's suppressed truth. So it's that weird mix. So that's religious consciousness. And then Bavinck goes a step further to say, well, what does religious consciousness look like? Is there like a morphology? Is there a way you can unpack it? And he says, look, he thinks there are similar, although other religious traditions are saying completely different things, in his experience and from his exegesis, especially of where Paul says in Romans 1:20, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been revealed. And Bavinck's, it's funny, I've read dozens and dozens of commentaries on that verse, and commentators struggle to know why does Paul choose those two things. Bavinck's exegesis, I think, is great here. He says, look, God's eternal power is the idea that at some level we know that we are creatures, um, and that we are, yeah, we are dependent upon something or someone else. Divine nature is that God has a nature. We're not just there's a personal relationship here, which means accountability. So dependence and accountability before the fall to God, after the fall to the things that we suppress and substitute with. So out of the clay of eternal power and divine nature, Bavinck says there are these well, he calls them direction signals or these magnetic points. He says there are these five questions, issues that people wrestle with all their lives, not consciously, but it's the unpacking of these that how people make decisions in their life in terms of their worldview, their hopes, dreams, desires. And this is what he calls the magnetic points. And there's five magnetic points, and they're all interrelated to one another, and that would be a longer conversation. But there's, and these are my terms, there's totality. Um, is there is this idea? Is there a way to connect? We all want to connect with something. We we struggle with being insignificant in our lives, but when we connect with something bigger, something, someone, some cause, we feel connected and we suddenly feel significant. And then when we feel disconnected, we long to connect with something bigger again. So this itch always has to be scratched, says Bavinck. Now, of course, in world religious traditions, there's all kinds of ways you can answer that. You could talk about Allah, you could talk about the Ummah, you could talk about uh, you know, Hindu or Buddhist concepts of oneness anyway. But what's interesting for me is I think that those things are exactly the same in our meta-modern, postmodern context of people wanting to find connection. So is there a way to connect? Norm, is there a way to live? There's always rules that we have, not just the Ten Commandments, but every culture has its own rules, who's in or out. There's norms of behavior. Is there a way out? Deliverance. We look for deliverance. We think there's a problem. The world's not right. What's the problem? We can't agree on that, but we think there is a problem. And what's the solution? And again, it's not just big questions like, what happens when I die or questions of redemption. I mean, I try to understand it in terms of even mini thing, how do I get through the day without another drink? How do I get through the night without the baby crying? It's also a looking back, it's sentimentality and longing. The C.S. Lewis idea of kind of, looking back, the romantics built ruins because it's a kind of, I wish the world was like this. So deliverance is looking forward and looking back. And then there's destiny. Is there a way that I control? And here Bavinck has got this great line. He says, we both lead our lives and we undergo our lives at the same time. And really, the history of philosophy, but also at a street level, are we in control or are we under someone else's control? And Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I think I'm the master of my own destiny. I can do what I want. I have agency. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I'm a puppet on a string. I'm a pawn in a game. I'm just a victim. What's really interesting about doing this with churches and getting them to think about these questions, I've done this like in different countries all over the world now. So, for example, I went to Slovakia and I've done it a few times in Slovakia. And the Slovaks, when I speak to a group of pastors, I said, does Slovak culture think that you're in control or under someone else's control? You know, we did a Slido poll. 99.7%. We are always a nation that think that we're under someone else's control. First, it was the Austro-Hungarians, then it was the Czechs. We're the bottom of the pile. No one bothers us about us. There's no point in doing anything because nothing will change. We have no agency. Now, can you imagine any American church where I've done this material? No, no American says
No,
that.
no, no, no. We are the
This is
masters of our own destiny.
exactly. So it's really interesting how that magnetic point kind of is configured, which I do think leads to a lot of the way that you approach apologetics or the gospel. So you've got these 4 points. You've got, totality, a way to connect, norm, a way to live, deliverance, a way out, destiny, a way we control. And then the final magnetic point, which I call the meta magnetic point, I suppose, is Bavin calls it higher power, but the question is there a reality beyond reality? And what's interesting is that I think in Bavink's context in Indonesia, everyone believes in a higher power. The question is, what's the higher power through which I get connection that gives me the norm, that delivers me, that I have a relationship with in terms of destiny?
What higher power system works?
Exactly. In the post-Christian secular West, it's the point that's most buried that needs to be excavated. And I think you get to it through the other points. So it's much more on the surface, I think, in Bavink, other religious contexts. It needs to be excavated. But I think the way that you get there is by pushing on the other 4 points to get there. Um, and so Bavink says, that these points are interrelated and they're all don't compartmentalize them. They're all interrelated and they all speak in there are perspectives on the one religious consciousness. And so that's his exposition. And then, well, he does it. There's a certain way that I've done it. I've become well. I've used this phrase a lot, and Tim Keller used it a lot. It was by another Dutch missionary, a guy called Hendrik Kramer, another Dutch Reformed missiologist. And Hendrik Kramer, just for a minute, this is a sidebar, just for a minute. We'll get back to the magnetic points in a minute. Hendrik Kramer was very instrumental. He was like the polymath at these great big missionary conferences at the beginning of the 20th century in Edinburgh and India, Tamboran. And he's quite influenced by Bart. He's a bit more Bartian than I would be, Kramer. But at the time, people are starting to say, look, we know that Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of religion, but we think other religions might be like stepping stones to Jesus. So you have books like The Unknown Christ of Hinduism, where people are saying Jesus is the fulfillment of other religions. And so Kramer kind of slams his hand on the table and says, no, 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 no. Jesus is completely different. You cannot compare other religions to the revelation of Jesus Christ. But if you want to use the word fulfillment, maybe Jesus is the contradictive or subversive fulfillment of other religions. Now, Kramer only uses that phrase once in a little essay he wrote. As I joke, I'm trying to build a theological career on it. But I do think this subversive fulfillment idea is absolutely brilliant. And, I always, what 1 Corinthians 1, you just see this, the gospel, Christ crucified, is foolishness. There's a confrontational message that is completely different from the world's message. It's utter foolishness. It's confrontational. And yet in that passage, Paul, and Tim talked about this as well, Paul talks about two ethnic groups, Jews and Greeks. I mean, why does he bother mentioning them? He could have just said, Jesus is completely different. I don't care what you believe. But he says they're Jews and Greeks. They have different worldviews, social imaginaries. Jews look for power, Greeks look for wisdom. And so Christ crucified is foolishness and a stumbling block. But to those who believe Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God, in other words, we might say, well, Paul, isn't that a felt needs gospel? You mean Jews are looking for power and Jesus is power. Greeks are looking for wisdom and Jesus is wisdom. Yes, in precisely a subversive way that they would expect, because a crucified Messiah is not powerful or wise. And yet, Paul is willing to speak in their cultural narrative to bring Jesus into the conversation. And so my big point to churches are in our apologetics, in our engagement, Christ always confronts and he connects at the same time. And some of us are great at the confrontation, but we don't do the connection. And some of us are great at the connection and don't do the confrontation. And it seems to me that phenomenologically or in an exemplary model, that's exactly what Paul's doing in Acts 17 because he's wandering around the objects of worship. And he could have said, hey, it's going to be really complicated if I try and get to Jesus from this unknown God because they might just think the unknown God is Jesus. But he does start where they're at, and yet he completely subverts because the unknown God isn't Jesus, but he starts where they're at. And so subversive fulfillment, I think, is a very powerful model of understanding the relationship between the gospel and culture. So, final piece, taking that idea of subversive fulfillment back to the magnetic points. And Bavinck doesn't talk about subversive fulfillment like this, but I think this is helpful. All of the magnetic points are subversively fulfilled in Christ. Christ is the way that we find connection, both communion with God and community in the church, but in a subversive way because we have to give give ourselves into union with Him without losing our individuality. So we're not just kind of part of the great abyss of being. We have individuality, but we still die to ourselves. Christ is the norm. Jesus is pro moral, the moral conservatives where the moral law doesn't change, but he's for progressives who are against the religious hypocrisy and the outsiders. Jesus is the one who delivers us, in most importantly, from the coming wrath. Jesus is the one who is both in control and our loving Heavenly Father. It's not an impersonal force. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So it's trying to understand in the book, especially, how Jesus in his person and work both subverts and fulfills those magnetic points in order, therefore, for us to get traction. My big thing is, especially in our post-Christian situation, where we don't have that Christian literacy or people are completely nowhere. I want to say to people, these are still religious people and they are living their lives out with the magnetic points. And you don't have to segue in an awkward way to get to Jesus because people are religious. And what we need to do, if you can understand, if this framework of the magnetic points helps, try to think about where are they looking for connection? Where are they looking for the norm? Because they will be, because they're image bearers. And then how do we naturally then say something about Christ who both confronts and connects with them at the same time? So the magnetic points framework is trying to be uh, a helpful tool, X-ray vision for us to understand people who we think these people have got nothing. Because I've been very influenced in Isaiah chapter 41, the passage about the idolater who makes their dinner or supper and then uses the fuel and makes a god, and the whole point is ridiculous. But Isaiah 44:10, I think, Isaiah 44:10, about the idolater, Isaiah says, no one stops to think. And I try to say to churches, your average non-Christian, your average non-Christian friend isn't having a podcast on how not to be a non-Christian with a guy in the States. People are just living their lives. And yet I think part of our job is to make people stop and think, like the Jeremiah 2, do you know that you're drinking from a cracked cistern here that can't hold water and there's a fountain of living water here? But we struggle to get traction because people are just so far post-Christian in my context. But I want to say they're religious. All the stuff that I've been telling you is true. And the great thing about Bavinck is that he was very hardline on this. So he says, there's no such thing as the Christian faith accommodating to other religious worldviews. There's accommodation isn't right. We need to repossess. We need to possess. But he's very big on meeting in love. He says, there's no difference between you and the person who you're speaking to about Jesus. The wounds which you're going to inflict on them, God has inflicted on you first. And we're just meeting one another in love. It's, one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. So that's the magnetic points framework. And then there's a few steps I've gone on there to talk about. First of all, we need to apply the magnetic points to ourselves because it's when we're magnetized that people are attracted to Christ through us. and how do we stay magnetized? So in the book, it's no great shakes. It's basically the ordinary means of grace. A friend of mine read the book and said, and he meant this as a compliment. He said, "I found the book, the ending, very anticlimactic, but it was because at the end of the day, we stay magnetized by word and sacrament, gathering together, being remagnetized, orientated every week, and sent back out. And so our evangelism flows from our discipleship. The more that we're magnetized and in love with Christ, the more people will see Christ through us. There's no great magic bullet there. There's no new technique. It's the ordinary means of grace. And then the third thing I think, which is I think very interesting in why I'm interested in your work, is I think Keller's last article before he died was this article called Lemonade on the Porch, where he said that just like lemonade is served on the porch of an American house in your typical American street as a gateway into someone's house, the culture has been the glass of lemonade. The culture has been the porch, but the porch isn't there anymore. So how do we create porches, third spaces, I suppose, that are not are linked to the church, adjacent, but not part of? And so I'm trying to pilot some things in the UK and elsewhere that I'm calling magnetic spaces that are opportunities for uh well, I'm calling it pre-evangelism because I think in our polarized kind of siloed culture, we don't have the opportunity to do pre-evangelism because we're not socially engaged with anyone.
Yeah.
How do we engage people where they're at? And I think the magnetic points then form a great kind of scaffold or framework for a magnetic space. Because in my contact, I don't know if it's the same for you, Paul, but there's always two sides of the horse that evangelicals are falling off on. You either go for bait and switch, we're going to do a course on mental health, and within 5 minutes they're thinking this isn't a course on mental health. This is someone trying to talk about Jesus. Or you just have social gospel, which doesn't mention Christianity at all.
Right.
And I think the magnetic points give a kind of a background integrity that you can put different canvases on according to the interests in your community or your church. But they stop that bait and switch because these are human questions that we can just answer and discuss together. But they do then give an opportunity to show how, as a Christian, Jesus answers these magnetic points. So as I say, conversational difference, and I think the importance of convicted civility, where we are able to have conversations where we disagree, can lead to conversional difference because then someone might go away from a magnetic space thing and think, I thought the Christians were completely crazy, but actually it did help me think that the beliefs, the views, and my life is actually connected to some commitments that I have I'd never thought about before. That's great for the gospel. Um, on the other hand, it could be, hey, those Christians said something, and I'm really interested in thinking about this a little bit more. And they spoke about Jesus. So the magnetic spaces idea, and there's been a few things that have been tried in teaching English as a second language. There's a great resource where they've this organization have taken 50 proverbs from around the world to teach people English. So you're learning English at the church, you're learning proverbs, which are distilled worldviews of different cultures, and then there's an opportunity to talk about bridge proverbs which link to one of the magnetic points, and then give an opportunity maybe to say something about Christ. But there's all kinds of things you could do: sports clubs, film clubs, book groups. But the magnetic points do give a kind of a theological integrity that, again, don't immediately go bait and switch or don't go to social gospel, which can be the problem. So that's Diego. Sorry, I've been rambling on. That is
No,
that
that's
is the
good.
magnetic points idea framework. There we are.
Very Keller-esque. I mean, when I'm listening to your talk, I listened between probably 2006 and 2012. I was listening to probably two, three Keller things a day. I mean, it was just I just worked through his corpus. Um, so that's all very Keller-esque, and I think especially in the subversive fulfillment, that's deeply Keller in terms of what he was
Yes.
doing in New York City.
Yes.
Um, I think, when I look at when I look at everything that I've been working on for the past 5, 6, 7 years, the point that I'm interested in terms of I think whether it's evangelism or pre-evangelism or apologetics, have been stuck on, make people stop and think. And it's sort of a think first approach to life, which I think I love what you said about Keller's piece in terms of people have no porches. And so, in many ways, I think social media platforms have replaced porches for many people at least in my context. And it's been very interesting watching sort of you see, Keller would often make the point about ministry in the 70s and 80s and the whole neo-evangelical the time of the neo-evangelical movements. You most of your strategies were involved in basically reanimating dormant Christianity that was there in the population, especially in the United States,
Yeah,
because there was so many of it, and so church outreach efforts involved. You just had a tiny little bit of bait, and then you would, let's say, open up that conversation and discover, let's say, where the dry rot was beginning in people's lives. Maybe it was in their marriage, maybe it was in their parenting. And the seeker movement was big into that because seeker movement was big into, I remember when I visited Willow Creek and Saddleback. When I came back to North America, our classes had a big push to send all of the pastors to Willow Creek all at one thing. And so I spent the first few years, taking a good look at the seeker movement. And that was always wisdom first. And you had the seeker movement. So probably our most successful church plant in Sacramento, even before I got here in 1991. Kevin Adams used to cut Bill Hybels' mom's lawn growing up in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And he came out to Sacramento and they had the seeker service on Sunday. They had the believer service on Wednesday night. Sunday sermons, you had your little skit, and almost all of your preaching was out of Proverbs, or it was something wisdom oriented to, I think, sort of engage in that bit of rot that was going on in someone's life. And maybe it was their budgeting, maybe it was their marriage, maybe it was their parenting, maybe it was their relationships. Maybe you had a therapist attached to your church or something like that. And so you would impress the people by basically saying, involvement in this church, getting into these Christian rituals and routines, getting into Christian formation, this can bring a tangible improvement to your life. And I think the seeker movement and the megachurch movement in a lot of ways leveraged that and was quite successful for a lot of people, bringing them into discipleship, stabilizing their lives in some of these areas that things were fraying, et cetera, et cetera. And, a lot of what has happened since the 90s and aughts have been sort of, at least in the United States, even in very less Christian places like the coasts where I've lived all my life.
yeah,
Um, there's been sort of a collapse of this dechurching. And what happens is you very quickly had people would, let's say, people in the Midwest would sort of hold, and people are still using secret church methodologies in the middle of the country because, and in the deep south, in the Bible Belt areas, because again, you're just sort of addressing the dry rot and you can sort of activate them. But what tends to happen is people who've had collapses in their lives tend then to go to the coasts because they're more anonymous. And I think you're then much more into a situation which is probably not, even in Sacramento, we are not at the de-churched levels of Europe, but that is accelerating and increasing. And so, when I was yesterday, I had a wonderful conversation again with this Orthodox father in in New York City. It was so interesting talking to him because, of course, I had known a lot about Redeemer and visited Redeemer sort of in its heyday with Keller in the middle of the aughts. And then just listening to him, now churches on the fringes are having things like teenagers come in and bringing their parents, and the teenagers are coming in with the kinds of they're coming in, basically with a meaning crisis framework where they've been on the internet, they've seen all the porn, they've spent their time doing video games, they've, you know, we're in a weird place right now where people, pornography gives people a non-biological STD. And that is sort of provoking a meaning crisis in people. And so when you look at the kinds of churches, even though they're small, so when I was in the UK, I did an event with Paul
Yeah,
Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw over in Ireland. And, part of what's happening, at least sort of in the Orthodox churches, and again, in my space on the internet, this tends to get exaggerated because people think, well, everybody's going Orthodox. But when you actually look at the numbers, they're really very small, especially, let's say, compared to, there's so many more evangelicals, there's so many more Christians. And so numerically, those 20, 30-year-old strategies are still, bearing fruit in some places. In it's almost always embody first in the really raggedy spaces because
yeah,
it's the internet as the front porch, which is a very strange front porch when your real where the real credibility is going to be found in embodiment rather than in the coherence of ideas or
yeah.
provoking thinking. There's going to be an element of that, but as of course as Newbigin said, the church is the hermeneutic of the gospel, and I
Yeah, yeah,
think that
and Schaefer talking about the final apologetic.
yes,
I,
yes,
I think that's where the because I would want to say that so the meaning crisis to connect with, I suppose, back to the magnetic points is when it's because that those itches are not being satisfied, scratched properly in terms of connection, deliverance, norm, destiny.
yes,
When they are, then like in a Christian tradition or in a maybe a traditional worldview, then you can see they are, or an ideology. Um, if, they are they are sought to be satisfied. I completely agree with you with the embodiment point, and I think my understanding of worldview culture wants to be like I've got yeah, I have a few issues, but I do think the Jamie Smith kind of liturgies stuff is quite helpful on that in terms of embodiment and what that means. I think the other thing, and again, I'm still trying to crack this, is Keller in New York was very contextualized. It is academic, it is professorial,
right,
it is intellectual.
right,
The magnetic, if the magnetic points and the anthropology that I've been articulating is true, then it's not just for people who are that way inclined. It's got to be for everyone. And
yes,
it's how do you reach all sectors of society with this same analysis that is not gonna, yeah, that is going to reach all types of people. So but it can, just as apologetics in general can become quite an intellectual, cognitive thing. I still think the analysis is true. It's just how do we reach everyone because everyone is expressing these magnetic points. And I think yeah, doing it in that kind of that embodied way, holistically, is crucial.
yeah. Well,
So
I
yeah,
think
I agree.
it's so early on, when I began talking to John Vervaeke, he was at that point talking about the religion that's not a religion. He had grown up in a fundamentalist community in Canada, very much went away from it, went into Taoism, Buddhism, eventually, you know, sort of helped found the cognitive science department at University of Toronto. He was a colleague of Peterson.
Yeah.
Jordan hasn't been able to get him to ARC yet. That'll be interesting to see how that goes. But one of the things I challenged John on early, because John was so downstream of Peterson, we sort of had my corner, which is sort of a real missiological hodgepodge. We had Peugeot, who was sort of, orthodoxy, that was their program, and Vervaeke has sort of discarded the religion that's not a religion and is pursuing sort of a Neoplatonic Silk Road thing. But it's very cognitive, and again, it's almost all for people with IQs north of 125 and have jobs where they're mostly on Zoom or using fingers on keyboards, and
Yep.
that's a slice of the world. And so I think I mean, churches. I think if churches are going to have to I mean, the unchurching, the de-churching has happened in many respects because of the difficulty of churches delivering on these magnetic points in terms of satisfaction. I think, to think about, John Piper's Christian hedonism. I mean, I think he was really onto something there in terms of there's there's going to have to be a satisfaction, but there's also the case where all of our satisfactions in this world, they're always pointers, and
Yeah.
that's this element of the age of decay that no marriage, Lewis wrote about this, really well in terms of we're always, even though this is our home, we're made for this world. There's
Yeah.
still a pilgrim aspect
Yeah.
in terms of, let's say, our a longing for the age to come. And so there's always that hungering edge in the church, but yet the church has to, at least in order to have credibility, needs to be able to satisfy these magnetic points in an embodied
Yeah.
way.
And the way that I express that sometimes, and maybe is you've got people's felt needs and you've got their fundamental needs.
Yes.
And often we either do felt need and we don't deal with fundamental need, or we bypass felt need to go straight to fundamental need. How do you go through the felt need to the fundamental need?
Yeah.
And I think that's where something like the magnetic point. So, for example, I'm trying to write this little book with an ex-student of mine who's an evangelist in Birmingham, second biggest city in the UK. And he's doing this great ministry. He's about to do a thing for men who are about to become fathers. So he's going to meet with these men, and throughout the 7 weeks, a practical thing is they're going to build a cot together. They're going to build a crib. They're going to learn how to build the crib, but they're also going to have some discussions about, when the baby comes, what do you do about anger and frustration? And you base it around these magnetic points
Yep.
to just try and get people talking. And again, these are going to be people who don't have a degree or aren't going to be able to articulate defeaters against Christianity. And yet there is something very practical about just living. If we are living out these magnetic points, then we need to see, and how do they resonate. So I think it is the how do you go through the felt need to the fundamental need. And I think that's the trick, the art. That's the sweet spot you want to try and find.
Yeah. Yeah.
And still trying to work out how you do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the points are great, though. I really do. And I hadn't seen these directly, but you bump into them. You bump into them in other things because there is a limited menu in terms of,
Yeah, yeah, and,
what
and
we're
and people
about.
and people always say to me, could there be more points? Did Babbage get? And again, people are willing to have a look. What's interesting though is what Babbage does, and this is what I think is really great biblically, is that often the worldview questions that we come up with, they're kind of been like they're imposed onto the text, whereas for Babbage, the five magnetic points come out of that Romans 1:20, eternal power and divine nature, dependence, this idea that we're creatures, that links to totality and destiny, accountability, that something's gone wrong and it needs to be fixed is norm and deliverance, and then the higher power. So actually you can see it as a um it's just an unpacking of that exegesis rather than saying they're these four questions that people ask, but we don't really know where we've got them from. So I mean, so they are kind of worldviewy kinds of questions, but for me, they really are tied to um, the Bible, and it's really interesting. And I haven't seen this elsewhere. I'm trying to chase it, see if I've seen it. But when Paul is in Athens and he quotes Aratus and Epimenides, he quotes their poets. Um, in him we live and move and have our being, dependence, divine. We are his offspring, accountability. So it's interesting that Paul actually, I think, picks up on what he's what he's going to write about in Romans on those two things of we're dependent creatures and accountable to something or someone, and we're hardwired with that. And even in our idolatry, we still look for dependent. Again, Isaiah 41 is brilliant on this idol creation. We have to build idols because to protect us, but the fact that we've built them means that they're useless.
Right.
Whereas God in that passage, he names Israel, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I've chosen, Abraham, my friend. So the solid God who doesn't change names us. So our identity is fixed, but shaky people build shaky gods. But there's still this instinct. That's an unusual passage because it very rarely talks about idol making, but the idol making is dispelling this idea that the idols can actually do any good. And so you got that bit about the idols about to topple, which is why idolatry and autonomy go very closely together. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. We make idols because we'd still rather worship them than worship the living God, but
Right.
actually they're completely rubbish. They can't help us when it hits the fan in life and they just fall over. So I think that's a very interesting dynamic there about, you know, the more autonomous we think we are, the more enslaved to other things that we become.
Yeah.
Um, and that seems to be borne out in so many ways.
Yeah, I agree. And I also like the subversive fulfillment again, I think there's so much of that in Keller's sermons. There's so much of that because he's always, this is the um it's obvious to me how you're living what you've always wanted. This is the better route to actually get at it because taking the path you're getting now is going to basically lead to an idol. And this is the only safe path where you can actually pursue it, but it won't become idolatry, and so it won't master your life. I
Yes,
mean,
yeah,
that was
exactly.
Keller.
And
Just Keller ran that thing again and again and again and again in how many different ways? It was
and
good.
and the thing that and maybe this isn't a weakness in Tim, but people have misunderstood him in a way that I don't think is helpful. Is that you always have? I think it's still important that, and Tim did do this, but I think sometimes he's misinterpreted. Is that idolatry is always against God? I mean, idolatry analysis is great for the horizontal as a heuristic kind of tool, but at the end of the day, it is against God. And I think the importance of the vertical God-centered nature of J.H. Bavinck elenchtics this idea of uncovering sin. The big question that you're always getting to when you're probing with someone is what have you done with God? And uh, I think that needs to remain front and center. And Tim was able to do it in a very almost effortless kind of loving pastoral way. But maybe sometimes people misunderstood that as being, well, he was too soft, he was too winsome.
Yeah.
But actually, there's still a real cutting edge to that. And some people, as I say to my students sometimes, you can do the subversive fulfillment and you're not using. I'd say, you need to use a scalpel, not a machete.
Yeah.
And there's a way of kind of macheting people with it.
Yeah.
But I do think that's important. That I suppose my question is always when I hear that the subversive fulfillment stuff's helpful, is I'm always interested in what before that what have been the other ways of doing it. I mean, surely haven't we always done that? then we may be able to articulate it more. But were we doing either pure fulfillment or pure contradiction? I mean, is that how it's what are the alternatives to subversive fulfillment where people could say, I don't like subversive fulfillment because I like this? I'm always interested to know is what is this?
So I came across fairly early on the work of Ezekiel Kaufman, who was a
Okay.
Jewish scholar in the 20s, 30s, wrote a book, The Religion of Israel, where he very much gets on this idolatry thing, where he says is the religion of the Bible is very, very strange in the ancient world because in the ancient world, basically, he said almost all religions in the ancient world assume that there's sort of this impersonal meta-divine realm in which these deities perform. And he said the Bible is very strange because the Bible doesn't have the birth of the gods, does very, very, very little with the war of the gods, and exactly what you described in terms of idols. The Bible just says idols are stock and stone. It's just, you know, and part of, I think, of what has been happening in at least the spaces that I've been around is, and I watched, for example, Jordan Peterson in his first on stage debate with Sam Harris. Brett Weinstein, this is in Vancouver, Brett Weinstein is sort of moderating. And they're getting through the debate. Basically, Peterson is kind of going through I would say, the end of postmodernity, where he basically says postmodernity basically leaves us saying everything is arbitrary. Modernity leaves us saying everything is locked into the whole show, as C.S. Lewis writes about in his book Miracles. Postmodernity leaves us everything's just an arbitrary narrative. And Peterson's whole project was I don't think everything is arbitrary because there seem to be fixed points. There's too many fixed points around. And so, Peterson is trying to talk to Sam Harris about a bunch of the things that Vervaeke will call combinatory explosiveness that there's what we're doing with our mind is we're reducing the world because we have to reduce it in order to engage it productively, et cetera, et cetera. The conversation's going nowhere. Every time Peterson sort of invites Harris in to work with me and build something a little with me, and Harris just isn't likes kicking it down. That's all. It's like two toddlers. Jordan wants to build with blocks. Harris kicks it down. And then finally they get to the end of the night and everybody wants to know, but no, 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 no. This debate is supposed to be about God. And then Harris's chief complaint about Jordan Peterson is that he's soft on theism. And okay, so Harris wants to set up the aughts debate on YouTube about God, yes or no. And so Peterson says, well, let me tell you about what I think God might be and how that might function. He opens up his laptop and he starts reading. And to me, I heard echoes from early reformational confessions in terms of what I would say God as arena. If God were to look away, the world would end. I mean, this is sort of an arenic God. In him we live and move and have our being. And of course, God is arena, but God is also agent. And so the God as arena, I called God number one, and the God as agent, I called God number two. Um, if you look at, let's say, if you go back to Kaufman or you look at world religions, you say religion, one way or another, is our attempt to try to gain purchase on the way the world works. And so it can be technology and laws of physics. It can be, how do I, sacrifices? How do I relate to the
Yeah.
gods? How do we get calm seas? Sacrifice,
Yeah.
Agamemnon's daughter, et cetera, et cetera. And that, of course, you find that in God as arena. You find that, very clearly in something like the book of Deuteronomy. Keep the covenant, I will bless you. Violate the covenant, I will punish you. So it's a very low resolution religion where it's karmic. It's do good things happen, do bad things happen. It's also then can be found in technology, can be found in wisdom, can be found in all of these things. But of course, the book of Job begins to push at this. And even in Genesis with the, why does, as Robert Alton noted, why in the book of Genesis is there's this subtle push against primogeniture? Why is it always the second son? And why is Israel the younger, he's the one down the line? And why is David almost even forgotten in front of Samuel? So you have this
Yeah.
subtle thing, and it really comes to sort of comes imagining in the book of Job, and it comes full flourishing in Christ, of course. But the one, the God number one isn't undermined completely. So there still are magnetic points that are in the world. These questions must be answered, but the answers to these questions in this world don't finally fully work. And of course, Keller poured on this, and like he was really on his, Christianity isn't a religion. He was really on that in the mid
Yeah,
aughts.
yeah, yeah.
Undermining religion, undermining religion. Tim Keller's take on the parable of the prodigal son. There's two ways to be, one is the obvious way and one is the way of religion.
Religious, irreligious. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I think that the subversive fulfillment really gets at that because even when I talk to, I have to be careful now because my audience is extremely diverse in terms of where they are religiously. But what's amazing about Jesus is that the first system of Deuteronomy isn't dismissed. Wisdom wisdom is never dismissed. And so right now, sort of in the post-Christian places that I'm dabbling, religion or wisdom is sort of the hot thing because,
yeah.
if you listen to John Vervaeke just did a good conversation with Elizabeth Oldfield on Unheard. And it's a good, if you want sort of a short way into John Vervaeke, that's a pretty good video because now suddenly, oh, we've got cognitive science and we know much more. Modernity is gone. Postmodernity didn't offer us much. So now in metamodernity, we've got the renewed search for wisdom, and we have science behind us, but it's not going to be scientism. And so again, we're trying to sort of scaffold up, which is fundamentally a religious enterprise.
Yes.
But the Bible has this very real but discouraging for many people. And that's where you come to the point of rebellion when C.S. Lewis says, we're finally rebels who have to put down our guns because we so want to construct that Tower of Babel to,
Yeah, yeah,
to get all the way up. And, as Lewis pointed out, and I think as the Bible says throughout, and all of what Jesus says in terms of, when Jesus is pointing to eschatology, when I read the Gospels, I almost always hear there's there's only so much you're going to be able to do in this dispensation. It's only going to go so far.
yeah,
And that then requires a new heaven and a new earth
yeah.
to finally fulfill. And so you can't simply, one of the things that John and I tend to go back and forth over is the two worlds mythology. I mean, no, we've got to get rid of the two worlds mythology. It's got to be one. We've got to get over all these dualisms. It has to be one final thing, but that one final thing leaves you with the limitations of this world where, and I think again, subversive fulfillment, there is fulfillment. There is, those who have left father and mother for the
Well, yeah,
sake of me
yes, yeah,
receive in this
exactly,
age.
exactly, and in the age to come, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
with persecution, because the
yeah,
persecutions don't go away. And so part of the, I think the honesty that Christianity affords is on one hand, it doesn't fall into nihilism because you've got the fulfillment, but that subversive layer is always there. And
yeah,
and and the church, so on one hand, the church has to do its best to make good on, the realizations of Christ in this age, even though it at the same time always says in this age will only get you that far. Your sanctification will only get to a certain
yeah,
point.
and yeah.
Good.
and that's why I related. I mean, again, if we bring it, thinking about, I've just done this piece for TGC on Arc where it's
Oh,
really
really? Oh, I
interesting.
want to read that.
Oh no, no, yeah, yeah, no, but it's called Peculiar and Yet Not Peculiar Enough. What the point is, it's a quotation from William Wilberforce because in 1797, when Wilberforce writes his bestseller on the professed religion of the middle classes, he says that even in 1797 in England, people want, he says, people want the Christian fruit basically without the Christian root. They don't want the peculiar doctrines. They just want the ethics. And you'll read the article. I'll be interested what you make of it because I thought Ark was great, but it was a very frustrating experience. And in some ways, Peter. I mean, you're the Peterson expert, but I'd never heard him live. I haven't really watched much of him. But that first talk where you think that bit at the end where he says, hedonism is the problem. What we need is voluntary self-sacrifice. And then do you remember what he said? Voluntary self-sacrifice is the capstone the builders have rejected.
I know.
And it's like you think that the irony of you're so close and yet you're so far away because I mean, how many times did you talk about Jacob's ladder? And this Chris Watkin, who's a philosopher of biblical
Yeah,
critical theory, makes this distinction between N-shaped and U-shaped. The N shape is the transactional, you do something for the God and the God will bless you. And the U shape is the breaking in of grace. But in that talk, Jordan Peterson, you just think it's going, it looks like it might be going U shaped. No, no, it's still completely N shaped. But that is the big difference, isn't it? I mean, it
yeah,
is and in some ways, that's the frustration of Jesus, you can't, Os Guinness, which I mean, I thought Os Guinness gave the best talk. It was brilliant. And he talks about the kind of cut flower syndrome. But I think Ark, and I write this in the article, it's almost cut flower. You want to talk about, we need to uncover, the Judeo-Christian worldview, Christian virtues, brilliant, brilliant. But without where it come, without grace, without Jesus, without the church. I mean, the church as an institution was conspicuous by its absence at Ark in terms of
yeah,
what we're going to do.
yeah,
And that's why I think it should, so near and yet so far, but
yeah,
amazing to have great conversations with people.
yeah.
But Jesus was not in the building, and I think Jesus needs to be in the building for in a subversive fulfillment way for the way to achieve what Ark wants to achieve
Yeah,
in terms
yeah,
of civilization.
yeah.
And so I do think that's where subversive fulfillment is important. But you're right. I think in everything you're saying, it's having I mean, it is. I know it's a kind of a truism, but the now and the not yet. And I think it's living with that as a kind of multi-lens understanding of how we live our lives.
Well, and
If
and our go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if your kind of listeners are interested, I've been going back over um, this very early letter called the Epistle to Diognetus. It's probably the first example of cultural apologetics. A philosophy student in 1436 found it by accident in a fish shop. He was about to wrap up fish. It's the only copy that we've got, probably written in around 130. And it's this anonymous author writing to this person called Diognetus about what Christians are like. And there's a quotation, I'll send it to you, Paul. It's exactly what you were saying. The Christians are a bit weird. They don't have a different clothes or different language, but they're sojourners in the world. There's this great line, and they marry as all do. They they beget children, but they do not kill their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. It's a brilliant kind of way of describing the early Christians. But you're right. I think there's always this, I want Christians to be completely involved in the world completely and yet detached at the same time.
Yes,
And how do you
yes,
have both of those things?
yep,
And I do think that's some of the perennial questions that we all struggle with, isn't it? And
yeah,
it's, I'm all for cultural transformation and all for the importance of the lordship of Christ in all of life. But I know that this isn't the new heaven and the new earth, and there's a certain amount of provisionality. And I know that ultimate my criticism with some of the two kingdoms stuff is that I think they want to separate off penultimate ends and ultimate ends, and penultimate end, how you work out something in a penultimate often has ultimate questions behind it, but there is still a difference between the penultimate and the ultimate.
right.
And it's this goes back, and this is why Augustine was so great in City of God, because I think he does kind of recognize that.
Yeah.
But the way that you articulated it is the lifelong journey of wrestling with that bone where you dig it, you think you've got it buried, and then you have to go and dig it up again and gnaw it again and bury it again. It's a lifelong journey, isn't it, to work out what, and I think you're right. I think probably a lot of the evangelicalism that I was brought up in was if you become a Christian, it's going to be really rubbish now, but don't worry, there's a new heaven and the new earth. And you deny yourself and carry the cross, great. But then you think, well, what does Jesus mean by if you give up now, you'll get more now with persecutions and that was that mark or mark or in Matthew 19, that is a great reflection on, what the blessings are now of living in God's world under God's rule and what that means,
Yeah.
while still recognizing that it is still penultimate. There you
And
go.
we don't have enough time to go into this, but the questions around Ark are, I mean, they're deeply theological because we have these questions of, okay, when I got back from, so I did the thing in Ireland, then I did Ark in the UK, and then I was doing estuary stuff in the Netherlands and Germany. Then I came back to London, and I had some time to walk through Kensington Park and Green Park and see Buckingham Palace and see some of these things. And I bumped into the Prince Albert's monument.
Oh yes, yeah, the big gold thing.
Wow.
Yeah,
And so, right now in America, they're having this conversation about, Christian nationalism, yada yada yada.
yeah,
It's a vitally important question. It has everything to do with this um, subversive fulfillment thing in terms of, okay, so you're right. You want all of these, you want the fruits without the roots in terms of Christian civilization. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali, in terms of her own personal journey, has come to the point of saying, wow, you people in Christian civilization, it's very impressive what you've done, but how? And then, and so part then what we have to do is ask questions. Okay, how does the church how does the church relate to these these civil structures?
yeah,
And been having this long conversation. Of course, you have King Charles III now. I was watching all of his I was watching those vows he had to take in terms of, what and it was like, wow, listen to these words.
yeah.
How does that work? And then, of course, um, you know, we're, you had this colonial period. That's why I was really curious about your family's history in
Yeah,
terms of, we had these lion cultures in the 19th century. And it was so interesting. So then I started at a little bit more time. So I started walking around looking at the monuments because I was actually at Oak Hill because I had a conversation with Glenn
yeah,
Scrivener and
yeah,
Tom Holland. And it was so interesting walking around looking at monuments because you look at these Victorian monuments and they're ambitious and lion-like and glorious, and then you hit the Great War monuments and it's just crushing.
yeah, yeah,
It's just, it was so interesting because, Prince Albert sort of in the middle. You have the little people down below. You've got the continents on the corners. You've got angels up above, and you've got this golden cross way at the top. And then I get to this one World War I monument, and it's got these black figures who were the doughboys, and the top is flat. You can just sort of feel the secularism come in, and for God died for a lot of Europe in the First World War, and
yeah,
and then even more so for others in the Second World War. And we're coming out of that period now, probably more into a lion period again, where you've got Trump wanting to be a
yeah.
lion, and you've got Putin and
Oh yeah, I
China.
mean it's what Rusty Reno talks about Return of the Strong Gods, the
Yes.
kind of very good.
But then to think, okay, how then, where does the church now in this post-Christian age, how does the church relate to these embodied institutions and cultures and structures. It seems to me that's so many of our conversations are there now. And
Yeah.
and
And that's where I think the where the global church, we need to help each other between, like, say, the UK and the US, because going back to my point about the Dallas thing, I've just never lived in a situation, I've never lived in a situation where there's, if sometimes the criticism of it is like of the Kuyperian neo-Calvinist stuff is, oh, you've got to be careful, it can become too triumphalistic. I mean, how could an evangelical in the UK ever be triumphalistic in the sense of, you know, those vows, and again, it makes it like it rubs salt into the wounds when you hear the moderator of the Church of Scotland give the king, the Archbishop of Canterbury, this Bible is the most valuable thing this world affords. These are the lively oracles of God, the rule of princes, and you're thinking it's even worse to think that it was like that. And now, I remember when the King James had its 500th anniversary, and the person who was curating it was a professor of university at the university, and he said he was in a seminar where the name of Moses came up, and none of the undergraduates had ever heard of the name Moses, apart from the Islamic student, the Muslim student, who said sounds a bit like Musa. I mean, that was so you've got this is the greatest thing this world affords, and then you have complete illiteracy. So I think, that kind of mindset of triumphalism. So in some ways, I suppose, again, I love the transformationist vision because I've never seen it, but I can imagine if you do have more power and money and numbers in a different context
yeah,
like yours,
yeah,
then those dangers are there. But I think that's where we need to help each other.
yeah.
Sometimes I do wish British evangelicals, we had that kind of more of that can do, let's entrepreneur, risk for God kind of thing. And probably other times in the States, there probably needs to be a bit more of a chastened understanding of um, the now and the not yet than there is in some of these discussions.
Well, one sets up the other because I mean the great dechurching that's going on in America is because of the church's inability to make good on those claims sufficiently, but also, all the way around because the post-colonialists need to be heard. The
Yep.
postmodernists need to be understood. There's a reason. I mean, Jenkins wrote
Yeah,
not
Philip
not many.
Jenkins, the next Christendom.
No,
The
no,
next.
another book. He wrote a book on the religious aspect of the First World War.
Oh, okay. Oh,
It
wow.
was it
Yeah.
was better. It was better than
Okay.
his other book, but it was an eye-opening book for me because what it gave a window into was, I mean, it's not seen today because of how the war changed how we thought back on the war. But when you look at how they went towards the war and with the war, it was a holy war. And people and so these and again, I think the subversive fulfillment, that tension that's created there,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
that Jesus holds, because of course, everyone is expecting Jesus because if you can raise the dead, how is it easier to raise the dead or to kill someone? Roman emperors have known forever how to kill people. That's easy. But Jesus
yeah,
can raise the dead. If he can do it with a word, if he can do it by touching the bier of the widow of Nain, what could he do to, an army with a word?
yeah,
And
yeah,
if a storm can destroy a Roman fleet and Jesus can still a storm, I mean, at one point you realize when people are looking at Jesus and seeing these miracles, you have to think about, given what their longing was to make Israel great again,
yeah,
why they're okay, Jesus. I mean, we've never had this kind of power before.
yeah, yeah,
Surely you're going to use it. And even after, I love people love the end of the book of Matthew. I think the best Great Commission is the first chapter of the book of Acts. Now will you restore the kingdom to Israel? And
yeah,
Jesus deflects.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and so all of those
And
tensions are there.
no, I know, and I just think of that passage in John where Jesus, he's bloodied, bruised, battered. Pilate says, don't you know I have the power to kill, release you, or say, or kill you? you would have no power over me if it hadn't been given to you from above. I mean, that is kind of, Jesus is all intents and purposes complete victim, and yet he still says, I still have the power, but this is how I'm going to show my power.
Right. And
And
at
that
first to
is,
Pilate, it sounds delusional,
yeah, yeah, exactly.
but Jesus, and I think it's that reason that these tensions don't go away, and they're there in the
Yeah,
questions of church and state, state churches versus
yeah,
American marketplace church.
yeah,
All those tensions are in there,
yeah.
and
And
Christians
I think
have
one
to hold those tensions.
And I think one thing I want to encourage Christians with, and this may be because this may just be the theologian coming out in me, but I do, I sometimes worry that when we're doing all this cultural analysis, which is so important, it can become quite overwhelming for people. I need a doctorate in sociology to understand what's going on. But if you know that there are these fixed points, this is a little bit why I like Van Til, because Van Til, he's a brilliant he says, look, in the Garden of Eden, you've got all the things that are going to play out for the next, X number of years. You've got rationalism versus irrationalism. You've got, you've got issues of sovereignty and agency. You've got all the big questions that philosophers will. So it's, there's nothing new under the sun. It's always the same stuff. Yes, we have to understand the different context in which those questions are asked. But I think it's reassuring to know that with a good theological understanding of what's going on, you can understand the times because there is nothing new, and it is just an oscillation. Whether in you go from modernity to post-modernity, or skepticism to head, it's the same stuff, and that's why I find that helpful to give a kind of an anchor. Or else sometimes I think, oh man, I haven't read the latest sociological research on X. Well, we need to do that, but at the same time, a good solid theological grasp of what's going on and what does it mean to live in the now and the not yet? What does it mean for Christ to both confront and connect at the same time? I think that goes a long way in terms of our witness to give us some confidence that we can address anything. And that's important. Yeah.
Well, it's getting late where you're at.
Great
So
chat.
the so you
Yes.
so what are the books that you've written? What do you want to recommend to people?
Oh yeah, so well, my two popular books are Plugged In, which is how and why we engage culture, um, and then this book Making Faith Magnetic, which is on the magnetic points. If you want to look at something a bit more academic, I did a big monograph called "For Their Rock Is Not Like Our Rock: A Theology of Religions," which I think has a bit of Kaufman in it as well. Actually, it's looking at a reformed theology of religions. How does Christianity relate to other religions, and what does the Bible say about that? And then various things that I've written chapters in on stuff on subversive fulfillment and apologetics. If you're interested in Keller did this book called Center Church, which Zondervan obviously knew they're onto a good thing because they then did three separate books from the big book, each with an essay, a response essay, and Keller re-responded. And Keller's essay on contextualization, I did the re-response, and then Keller responded. And that's interesting because I try to contextualize Tim on contextualization. I go a bit meta there because and try to give an apology for why I think Tim did things the way that he did. But yeah, if you want to start, I'd say start with the Making Faith Magnetic, and the Plugged In book would be the first things. If you're really interested, my PhD thesis on what happens to people who don't hear the gospel is still in print somewhere, so you can look at that as well. But
Oh,
they're the things I'd
interesting.
start with. But check, I'd really be interested in your take on that the ARC review that I've given for TGC. So
Yeah, I'm
that'd be
definitely
good.
going to look that up.
Great.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you for
No,
staying
thanks,
up
Paul.
late.
No, it's fantastic. Great to providentially bump into you through a mutual friend, and the Lord takes us on these paths to meeting new people. So I'm really pleased, and it is great solidarity. And I think I'm really interested in the estuary stuff, and yeah, want to find out more about that. So that would be great.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you, Dan. Well, you have a good night's sleep.
You too. Thank you.
All right,
Blessings.
bye-bye.